news conference. So if anybody wants to review the recording later, we'll be able to provide a link to that. And thank you very much again to all the participants joining us today for this virtual news conference to launch the 2020 Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction. Just like to note again for journalists who have joined us that questions may be posed to the panel at any time via the chat box. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button to activate that, and you're very welcome at any time to start to put any questions that you might have. If you would, please just include your name and affiliation, and just let us know if the question is directed to a specific panelist. And it's my great pleasure now to welcome the program experts and officials and to introduce the three speakers. They are Martina Otto, who is the head of the GlobalABC Secretariat and head of the UNEP's City Unit. Ian Hamilton is the Associate Professor at University College London Energy Institute and Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Oliver Rapp is Executive Director of the Buildings Performance Institute Europe. Sergio Israel Mendoza is Director General of Environment, Urban and Tourism Promotion, Mexico's Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources. And Cedric Demise is Vice President and Group Public Affairs and Government Relations at Lafarge Holk. And I'd now like to invite Martina Otto to provide some introductory comments, followed by Mr. Hamilton, Rapp, Mendoza, and Demise.
Thanks very much, Terry. And before we get into the key messages of the report that we're launching today, a quick word on the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and why we are issuing this annual report. And the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction was founded at COP21 to put the emphasis on a sector that is so critical for our well-being, looking at the time we spent in buildings, our economies, looking at the share of the sector in national GDP and employment, and for climate action, looking at its high share of CO2 emissions. We do make reference to waking up a sleeping giant because the sector has so much potential that to date has not been harnessed, at least not at the level that we need. Over the past 5 years, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction has grown to over 150 members, bringing together national and local governments, private sector, civil society and academia, intergovernmental organizations, as well as initiatives in the built environment space. And we've shaped a common vision of zero emission, efficient and resilient buildings and construction, and the recognition of the need for radical collaboration to overcome the sector's fragmentation to increase pace and scale of action. And just as the global and regional roadmaps that we have launched earlier this year, and which provide a framework and a process for action that is now being taken up at the national level, the Buildings Global Status Report is a flagship product of the GlobalABC. Tracking progress annually, it is meant to inspire action by recognizing the positive developments and by highlighting also existing gaps. It is also a means to bring together a growing community, drawing on inputs from over 110 contributors this year, and the intent is to widen this group as we go along. And it's also a means to highlight emerging issues. For the first time, we've included circularity, cooling, and nature-based solutions, and of course, health, which has just become an additional driver for action in the sector, not least highlighted by COVID-19. I think it's fair to say we have woken up the giant. We know the direction where the giant needs to go to, that is towards zero carbon buildings. And the present report highlights that we now need to put on the 7-mile boots to win the race to zero. COVID-19 recovery packages, and you will hear a little bit about that in a minute, can help us fast track action to building back better, literally. And the UNEP emissions gap report, which was launched last week, calculated that if governments invest in climate action as part of pandemic recovery, and if they solidify emerging net zero commitments with ambitious pledges at the next climate meeting, they can bring emissions to levels broadly consistent with the 2-degree goal. The buildings and construction sector has a shovel-ready panoply of actions. And from the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, we do know the economic and job creation benefits resulting from spurring building renovation. So in sum, we're not on track overall, and the buildings and construction sector is no exception to that. But we do have a short window of opportunity to set us up for speeding up the annual decarbonisation of buildings by a factor of 5. But now to the findings, handing over to Ian, one of our lead authors. Ian.
Thank you very much, Martina. I believe now the slides should be shared. And Martina has already alluded to some of the main issues that this report covers, and so I won't go over those again, but just to note that this is a collaborative effort, as Martina said, among a series of key partners and reporting of information from across the world and contributions from the many who have taken part in this, and covering the drivers and trends around 2019, but as this report does also pick up on the reality of 2020 as well, and really looking forward to what the issues are in terms of what 2021 needs to bring in terms of actions. So as Martina outlined, we'll dive into the findings. So the key message for this year, certainly around CO2 emissions, is that there has been an increase from the trend. Historically, for the last several years, we'd noted that CO2 emissions had stabilized among the buildings sector with modest change, but this year we've seen an increase for the 2019 year. The issue being that more demand around existing fuels that have been used in terms of their direct emissions, so fuels such as gas, as heating fuels, alongside an increased demand for electricity. And particularly among those are services that rely on electricity, such as appliances, lighting, and also an increased demand for air conditioning. And the IEA really point this out as being one of the core drivers of future emission trends around the demand for cooling, particularly in countries where there is a lack of cooling service demands. So when we look at the share around the overall energy-related CO2 emissions and overall energy demand, buildings make up a sizable component of that. And so it's important to note that this year for 2019's emissions, buildings have increased, and that's in the wrong direction. And this also has a marked effect as what we're talking about in the overall trends being captured that my colleague Oliver will discuss in the tracker. When we look at how things have been progressing, in particular around the trends and drivers, as we build more buildings and floor space overall increases, particularly among fast emerging economies and a stable level of increase in established economies, is that emissions alongside that have in many ways decoupled from floor area. This is a good thing, but it does mean that it's quite sensitive, and we need to be quite clear as to where continued growth and development occurs, that there's a real opportunity for decarbonization to take place among the building sector. And so as we see that while energy and emissions continue to decouple from demand of floor space area, this is quite sensitive, and without proper approach towards more efficient building construction, this trend could be sent in the wrong direction. One of the key messages overall around the investment side, so incremental investment, this is the additional investment in energy efficiency among the building sector. So for products and appliances, for materials, the construction of more efficient buildings over the normal standard is what we're talking about here. And in 2019, this overall incremental investment has increased, and it's increased from previous years, which is a very good sign. The issue that we're facing, however, is that overall in 2019, the building and construction sector increased greater than 4.5%. So the issue being that although for every dollar being spent on improving energy efficiency, far more is being spent on conventional construction approaches. And in order to reverse the trend, we need to see investment in energy efficiency at or exceeding 3% per year. That means that each year we go forward, there needs to be an increase in this investment that are at least among these levels and beyond. And for 2020, the challenges that we would see are that the drop in overall construction will have an effect here. And so the anticipation for going forward needs to be that, as Martina alluded to, the pandemic and economic recovery actions needs to be able to support these actions around investment and efficiency and to achieve the 3% that we need going forward. So the reality, however, is that this is a major investment area. The International Finance Corporation, the IFC, has noted that in our report, the opportunity of investment of 24.7 trillion to be invested over the coming decade is a real potential for where these actions could take place. And so being able to work with major investors, banks and financiers around how to allocate funding into this area means that there's a great amount of value and potential that this investment could yield. A lot of this lies in emerging markets, and this is really important because this is also where, as we mentioned before, we see a lot of the floor space being allocated in terms of construction of new buildings and where the economic and demand for new appliances and services will take forward. Alongside that, as I mentioned, the potential for purchasing more efficient technologies and to invest in research and development of further improvements is really critical in these markets. Key ingredient towards this is really what the purchase focus is. So green building certifications, the use of building codes to ensure that the buildings being built today are both efficient and resilient for the future. And a part of that is that the investment in these building is being taken forward by developers, and developers see green buildings and more efficient buildings as part of their unique selling points. When it comes down to national governments, the challenge is very clear. For many who are focused on building their nationally determined contributions this year, it's really vital that they continue to use those as a way of sending a signal overall. And the NDCs in 2020, this year, there are a further 17 countries who have submitted or updated their updated their first NDC or submitted a second one. And buildings continue to be present, but our call for action here is that NDCs need to be more clear around the strategies that countries are taking to support decarbonization of buildings. And as we've mentioned before, there's such a lot of benefit to being able to do so. And so the reality for NDCs coming through to COP26 is that more and more need to make very explicit instruction as to how they focus on mitigation. The potential, as mentioned, around what this investment could mean, what these national strategies could offer, is an economic stimulus in the sense of being able to employ and service, many in this field to be able to create jobs. And these numbers that are recently published from the IEA sustainability report that we focus on in our report is that building energy efficiency retrofit and the construction of new and more efficient buildings yield considerable amount of jobs per every $1 million of spent. And we see that to be true in the reality for where investment around pandemic economic recovery in the building construction sector is that it could offer quite an effective way of incentivizing and stimulating the economy. So for construction workers across the world, this could be a real important reality check for being able to support their livelihoods and continue to allow for cities to be constructed in efficient ways. I'll hand over to my colleague, Oliver, who will describe now the Building Climate Tracker, which is new this year.
Thank you very much, Ian. You have just heard many details how the buildings and construction sector is addressing the climate challenge. It is important to keep these details in mind, but it can also be useful to have a simple and transparent statement whether the sector is on track to live up to the Paris Agreement. We have therefore decided to develop a tracker which describes the situation and its change over the years. We chose 2015 as the starting year, as this is the year of the Paris Agreement, and we selected a range of indicators which describe, on the one hand, the efforts made by policymakers in the private sector, and on the other hand, the impact which was achieved. And you can see the indicators which we have selected, and you can see their weighting on the slide in this small graphic. We followed an OECD methodology for the creation of this tracking index. and use data provided in earlier reports from the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, from the IEA, and from own research. Ian, could you please go to the next slide? The resulting tracker shows that in the first 2 years since 2015, when we start tracking, there was progress and the sector was moving in the right direction. It was on track to achieve full decarbonization by 2050, following a linear pathway of change. This linear pathway of change to full decarbonization is the blue line, which you can see in the graphic. And the orange line is the development of the sector, the progress of the sector. You see that since 2017, the tracker shows a slowing down of progress. In fact, it is losing momentum, which you can see as the curve is turning downwards. This reflects a slowdown and stagnation in effort, which in turn reduces the positive impact on decarbonization. Now, in order to get the sector back on track, it needs to increase its speed of change by a factor 5 compared to what has been achieved on average since we started to track since 2015. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Oliver. So what does this look like? Well, the time for action to decarbonize is now. The global building construction activity being ramped back up under economic stimulus is one of those situations where to align towards decarbonization for the Paris Agreement is really critical. So recovery packages that can both support and enhance nationally determined contributions is a way in which we can ensure that we are building back greener and better. So for national governments, we really want to take note and ensure that they are focused on these actions and supporting their NDCs towards net zero buildings. And this is really important for what we would like to be able to see as a tracking for the subsequent year, looking, of course, to 2020 being so disrupted in many ways, but being able to see that this is, in terms of an acceleration, a V towards heading back on track for Paris Agreement. So the reality is that it's not just national governments, though. It is across all sectors and all collaborations of both public and private actors. And I think this is really where the GlobalABC is a champion across those groups. And it's very important that their voices and their actions are being highlighted. And so our report this year does both that. It focuses on national national actors. It looks at private sector actions and really also across what the importance for this as a major issue for all citizens. So thank you very much for joining this part of the presentation of the findings. We have a lot of great material in the report we're very proud of this year. And again, to say thank you to all those who have contributed to this effort. And I'll hand back now to Martina to go to the next speakers. Thanks so much.
You're muted, Martina. You're muted.
Sorry. Not necessarily to me, but to our next speakers. So if we go in order, Sergio, if we could ask you to come in on the experience from a national perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Martina. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you the vision of Mexico Ministry of the Environment, particularly in the area of building and construction, from the perspective of climate opportunity that is available in the sector right now. Well, the national scenario of sustainable building in Mexico highlights the need to agree on a comprehensive national strategy that ensures the coherence of programs and action, overcoming gaps that prevent the strengthening of individual efforts towards the achievement of common goals. So then, the critical issues to transform the building and construction market refer at least three aspects. One, the disarticulation of federal initiatives, policies, and regulations with respect to the local ones, which must obey the particularities of each city and the minimum national standards. Two, the lack of updating local building regulation to establish minimum standards for all buildings and to encourage better practices. And 3, the relevance that should be given to location and climate design compared to other aspects of building life cycle, as well as informal processes in terms of environmental impacts of projects. Since 2013, Mexico has made progress in establishing a national standard for sustainable buildings, adopting an integrated approach to the different aspects throughout the various stages of the life cycle that applies to all types of buildings, such as the quality of the indoor environment and the passive and active measures for energy efficiency. Federal government has also succeeded in signing agreements with the private, social, and academic sector to deploy initiatives for raising awareness and co-create local capacities. Furthermore, with the support of international cooperation, we've launched a guide for energy efficiency in the tourist facilities. Additionally, in alliance with the Urban and Territorial Ministry, we're working on various policy instruments about resilience of human settlements and climate initiatives. In this very moment, governments are focused to the green recovery. That's why building and construction play a big part in that. For Mexico, green recovery means building strategic alliances that transform construction practices for better and more efficient buildings that ensures multiple benefits for all. Mexico and Latin America are facing particular challenges that add them to the global ones and need coherence to ensure transformative and positive effects towards zero emissions and resilient buildings and construction sector. So the responsibility of the Federal Environmental Ministry about sustainable construction and building opportunities is to join this global effort, focusing on the minimum standards where the circular economy and energy issue are the key elements to achieve cost benefits to multiple dimensions and a resilient built environment. Finally, we consider that the role of GlobalABC is undoubtedly a key trigger for progress in this regard. And we hope that in the next report on the global situation of buildings and construction, Mexico can share relevant achievements in this area. Thank you all for the invitation, and please, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. And I'm sure there will be questions to the experience as well that is being made at the national level. And we now also have a perspective from the private sector, another member of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And as Terry already introduced, Cédric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martina. So my name is Cédric Demeus from Lafarge-Holcim. Lafarge-Holcim is a global construction material company. Not active in Mexico, unfortunately, but we never know. But I'll give you a perspective from the private sector. And my starting point will be one of the findings from this year's report, which is the need for radical collaboration. I think radical is the right word. And what does it mean? So if I start from what we do as a company, as a global company, as you can see from the logo there, we've joined the Race to Zero this year, and we're very proud of that, with an SBTI validated roadmap to 2030. For those who do not know what SBTI is, it's the science-based initiative, which means that our pathway is validated by sound science. It's an authoritative external validation, and we are working with them to define the 2050 pathway. And in order to walk the talk, we've launched on several markets around the world, on different continents, a range of green concrete that we call EcoPact, that have an improved carbon footprint that ranges between 30 and 100%, meaning including carbon neutral concrete, depending on your project and what you need. And we did that in order, not because there is a huge demand for it, but in order to start engaging with our value chain, with our customers, with our architects on building, starting to build carbon neutral today. Now, the reality is that global trends tells us that we will add 2.5 billion people to our cities over the next 30 years. And I read last week a report that translated that in housing needs. That is equivalent to building 13,000 houses every day all the way to 2050. That is overwhelming. And that requires, although we are very proud and what we do at LafargeHolcim is extremely significant, we need to amplify that and ensure that this is happening across the supply chain, across the entire construction value chain. And in order for that to happen, it requires unprecedented and radical collaboration on two levels. The first one is between industry and policymakers, in order to build together the business case that is necessary to embed carbon neutrality, circularity, and societal functionality across the decision-making processes. And if we have that, we'll be able to sustain the extraordinary investments that are needed to do that, because our net zero roadmap is backed up by a business plan and finance. And that is required across the value chain. And secondly, this collaboration between industry and government is needed to change the behavior of the market, of the decision makers in the construction value chain, so that the low carbon solutions and products become the most competitive way forward, which is not the case today. The second level of collaboration that we need is across the construction value chain itself, so that we find ways to systematically integrate sustainability performances in the decision-making process that we have. And traditionally, us in the building sector, in the construction sector, we think in terms of safety, cost and affordability, and durability. That's what drives the mind of people involved in construction. And we need to put sustainability, performance, circularity on the same level. And that needs to be done in a way that respects or is technology and material neutral. No single solution, no single building material will provide the answer. We need everything. And also ensuring that the value chains really embeds the principle of whole life performance. What is a 1.5 degree aligned building? What is a carbon neutral infrastructure? We need to define it so that the whole value chain embeds it from the beginning, the conception of the infrastructure, all the way to the delivery and the use of it. And that requires multi-dimensional, multi-skills innovation that goes well beyond industry, well beyond technology and materials and the construction sector itself. And I think the last point I will make here is the one of skills. It requires the development of new skills that will respond to the paradigm shift. And the future of the construction sector, or the construction sector as we see it evolving today, it's not just the technical skills and the use of new materials. It's about data science. It's about robotic programmers. It's about system thinkers. And we need to develop through wide and systemic collaboration all of these skills that will enable us to respond all together to this paradigm shift. So Martina, I will stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Cedric. I'm going to jump in just to repeat for the information of reporters that journalists may be posted at any time via the chat box. And if you could, we're going to prioritize questions from the journalists in this remaining 30 minutes. So if you could include your name and the affiliation and your organization affiliation, and indicate if the question is directed to a specific panelist. I will begin, however, with a question from Roland Hunziker, who I believe is World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And he's got three questions. The first one actually, Cedric, if I may, to you. How do you achieve up to 100% reductions of emissions in EcoPact concrete?
That my response will respond to one of someone else who's asking the same question. The way we do it is we use all the levers that we have available in terms of cement manufacturing. Use as much alternative material as possible, as much alternative non-fossil fuels as possible. In the manufacturing from cement to concrete, we use all decarbonated material as possible, and we really go all the way we can. The fact that today we cannot get to net zero, that's why I'm calling it carbon neutral, the remaining carbon today in the range of EcoPact, Lafarge-Holcim EcoPact is offset nationally. It's not a global offsetting material. Every market offsets it nationally. Is it the final solution? No. We'll need to get to net zero. However, we can get to carbon neutrality today, which is the first step and an important step, because we need to start engaging with architects, with engineers, with construction firms, with investors. I don't mean our investors, I mean investors in the built environment, that we can embed carbon neutrality today in construction. And of course, we will not stop there. We will need to get zero once we have carbon capture technology sorted out and operationalized across our operations and so on and so forth. But this is the first step.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions for Oliver on the tracker. Again from Roland Hunziker and one from Alex Storch in Austria. Roland asks, how or does the tracker consider the level of ambition and also enforcement of building energy codes, and the level of ambition and the impact of green building certifications? And then Mr. Storch asks, how is the tracker taking climate factors and annual heat and cooling days into account?
Thank you very much, Terry, for the questions, and thanks to the participants for the questions as well. First of all, the question about the level of ambition and the enforcement of building codes, and actually any regulation impacting the carbon footprint of buildings, is a very important one. What we're trying to do in the tracker is to, as I said in the beginning, is to simplify information and to really make a judgment on the implementation of building codes and their effectiveness would require a global benchmarking, which is a very interesting study, but we could not do in the context of this report. But I'd be happy to tackle that as BPIE and together with many partners to do that one day. But it would be a major exercise. But it is true that we need to essentially monitor that as well, how effectively policies are really being implemented. The question on the climate days and whether heating and cooling degree days are included as well. The answer to that is only indirectly, because we are including the building sector energy intensity as one of the inputs for the tracker. And this energy intensity, of course, if you then look at the sub-data, which is below that, normally includes information on heating and cooling days, but it's not directly visible in the tracker as such, as we're trying to really summarize the information and make it relevant for a less technical audience to simply have a transparent index, which is tracking the progress of the sector towards full decarbonization.
Thanks very much. A couple of questions looking for clarification. Just one from the Daily Mail and another from S. Glory. I'm not sure of the first name, but the first was the industry share of carbon in 2019, and in gigatons, it was 38% of total global energy-related CO2 emissions. in 2018, but was this in gigatons? And to confirm, this figure combines the emissions from keeping buildings operational and the construction of new buildings. And the other question is whether the US dollars, 152 billion US dollars spent on energy efficiency concerns only renovation. And perhaps that's a question for Ian, I'm not sure.
Sure. Thanks very much, Jonathan, for those questions. So on the emissions side, the 38% includes, as you said, all building operations related emissions from energy. And then for the additional, so that in itself is 28%, and the additional 10% comes from the energy related emissions from the construction of those buildings and the fabrication of those materials coming from across steel, concrete, glass sectors. These numbers, which the IEA help us in producing, they cover, broadly speaking, those energy system related emissions and those construction aspects of the buildings. So overall, though, the 28% is approximately 10 gigatons of CO2, and then you add on to that those related to materials and construction, which is another 3.5, as we've put in the report this year. So those two things then get combined, approximately 13.5 or so gigatons. That has been an increase from last year, where overall in our reporting for the global status report, that buildings were, instead of around 10, they were just under 10 at around 9.7 or so gigatons of CO2 emissions. And then construction related activities were more or less the same, around 3.5 or thereabouts. So what we've seen overall is that the emissions from the sector have increased. That has been, as I said before, related quite a lot to the demands changing. So more electricity being consumed across the building stock this year than previous years. And of course, the greater number of buildings that now require energy in terms of every year, more CO2 related to that. So the other question around the incremental investment side is, no, it's not just refurbishment. Refurbishment is one part of that, but it's also to do with each new building that's being built that is built to an even higher and more energy efficient standard. So what that number comprises is both the refurbishment activities, say from government stimulus programs, or those who go out to invest in their buildings to upgrade to even better performing heating systems or cooling systems or the like, or insulation. And then the other side is, as buildings are being built, there are those buildings that are being built according to the standards or the conventional practices in those countries. And then alongside that are going to be simply better buildings in terms of their efficiency being constructed. So that's what that 152 captures.
Thank you very much. Going back to Cedric, a question from Elaine Robert from the news organization Climatico. Can carbon neutral construction be competitive today, and would a higher carbon price help? And if so, at what price?
So I need for about an hour and a half to answer the question. But very good question. I would give, well, I would make 2 points. The first one, today it's mainly driven by a question of vision and ambition. And what do I mean by that? We are in the UK, for example, embarking on the construction of, I think it's Europe's very first carbon neutral motorway. It's not us who decided it. It's, I think the agency is called Highway UK or Highway England. They have embedded carbon neutrality in their procurement. This is the one central criteria that define the project and upon which contractors and material providers were providing offers. And that become then your carbon neutrality offer and solutions become by definition competitive. So that's the first thing. So imagine if construction codes in a certain country say, well, if you build a new single family house, you should reach a maximum of X CO2 per square meter. But then your low carbon offers become by default competitive, whether or not you have a carbon price. Now, in the regions where you do have a carbon price, I think it's not about the the level of the carbon price is the relevance of the carbon price. And where we are operating and there is a carbon price, I think it hasn't achieved yet what we need to achieve, meaning that more carbon efficient solutions are more competitive in terms of price. And that requires a different form of carbon pricing. I think we need to embed both emissions, so the supply side, and consumption. So that's the demand side. And if both are embedded in the carbon price, you will be able to create more competitive environment for low carbon materials and solutions, whichever the material is, whichever the solution is.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Nils Larsen, excuse me, with the International Initiative for a Sustainable Built Environment regarding impacts of COVID-19. Although there is a prospect for mid to long-term co-benefits between health measures and climate actions, there will be conflicts in the short term because of increased energy required for ventilation systems using more outdoor air. Perhaps that's more a comment. And Martina, do you want to respond to that?
Well, not directly to the the need for more ventilation systems, but per se that there will be a drive, and the last word will still be out. What it means, what the pandemic will have shifted in terms of our expectations from buildings, and what it will mean for building design going forward. And I think there is a whole world out there looking at how do you achieve better ventilation, passive solutions as well. I think it's the last word on that one is still out. There may be some short-term conflicts for sure, but I think in the longer term, health will become a major driver as well for changes in the building design.
Does anybody else want to comment on that, Ian?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, you're absolutely correct in that. And I think that the safety and well-being of how we use our buildings, you look a lot across, the global building stock in terms of their ventilation and exposure for air pollution, indoor sources and from outdoor sources. And this is just really coming into the fore. And I think that when you look at green building standards and certifications that are really adopting the practice of more healthy indoor environments and the implications that has for what buildings can contribute to overall health and well-being of communities, as Martina alluded to, this is going to be really important for us in terms of our designs, but also our refurbishments. And I work in the UK, where the need to be able to refurbish buildings to ensure that they're not reducing ventilation is really important, so that we need to have warm, healthy homes that alongside that are adequately ventilated to ensure that we don't have problems of mold growth or air pollution from indoor sources. So I think it's really key now that our attention is being turned to this, because it's a growing issue in respect to refurbishment to do it right.
Thank you very much, Ian. Perhaps, Sergio, you might like to respond to the question from Ishan Kukreddy with Down to Earth magazine in India. He asks, is there a difference in trends in developed and developing countries?
Sure. Well, I think obviously there are differences. Perhaps I don't have the vision of the two scenarios. But from my perspective, and obviously in developing countries, the trends are very different, because we are working on different elements to fight with the climate change. So in this case, the sector of buildings and construction is right now working on different policies, and we don't have the same structure, the same policies to face that. No? So I think maybe some of the guys who present, maybe Oliver or Ian, can express better that. No?
Sure. I mean, just very briefly to pick up on what Sergio was saying around codes and standards, and really this is the practice of building, and it needs to be contextually sensitive. It needs to be appropriate to the condition, and I think this is where the trend around more sustainable building design concepts, bioclimatic designs that are making use of, on one hand, nature-based approaches, towards saying, are buildings being built in the right climate for the right condition? That's one aspect. The trends around what we're seeing in terms of what's being built. You look at emerging economies, and we're seeing a lot of construction that, on one hand, is emulating what's being built elsewhere, and maybe could be better improved and adapted to the local circumstances. So, glassy towers in very hot climates don't tend to go very well for air conditioning needs. Alongside that is, growing number of development in and around major cities in the world, and the need to accommodate and house in terms of a housing crisis, which our report also picks up on and Martina mentioned, is really important for us to make sure that which is being built, either formally or informally, is making use of strategies that can ensure comfort and well-being, but also security and safety. It's really important that these buildings are able to be resilient to future climate conditions. And at the moment, there's a real concern around that. So I think the trends there are on one hand, supporting them with knowledge and access to materials and designs is really, really critical. And alongside that is being able to support them through regulatory mechanisms and ensuring that developers are aware of how they could be building that are more appropriate to the design context.
Maybe if I'm allowed to come in on that one as well, I'd like to encourage a look at the roadmaps that I mentioned at the outset. We have done a global and 3 regional roadmaps, the regional roadmaps for Africa, Latin America, and for Asia. And they've been done in a multi-stakeholder process, engaging over 700 experts in this process. And they point to differences. So overall, we look at the same big topic areas that is similar. But then what the stakeholders thought was achievable in one context with regard to the other is slightly different in terms of level, but also in terms of emphasis, what to be picked up. And I just wanted to highlight that in addition to all the good things that Ian already mentioned. And maybe just finally to state the obvious, that if we look at the starting point, basically in a lot of developed countries, obviously we look at much more of renovation, because a lot of the buildings are built that already influences the trends there as well. And we will see a lot of growth in particularly fast-growing emerging countries. Over.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to come back to a question for Oliver and the tracker. And if the tracker is taking climate factors and annual heat and cooling days into account, I don't know that was.
Terry, I think I answered that earlier by referring to the fact that we include the specific energy consumption per square meter or per square foot, and that relates back to those heating and cooling degree days.
Very good. So we have another question from Nils Larson, and his question is, given the fact that renovation and performance upgrading of the existing building stock must be a priority, what are your views on reductions in value-added taxes on materials and equipment related to a performance-linked refurbishment, while increasing VAT commensurately on new construction? I think Cedric wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I can provide a perspective on this. I agree with your thought that providing a reduced VAT rate on high-performing or low-carbon materials and solutions and refurbishment is definitely an incentive. And coming back to the previous question, that's one of the elements that can contribute and make low-carbon construction more competitive today. At the same time, the problem is not new construction. You have many instances where buildings that were built at a certain moment in time cannot really be refurbished to meet today's energy performance. And it is more efficient in terms of material and resources to simply deconstruct this building and rebuild it with modern technologies, modern material. And it's on a case-by-case basis. You can't say that new construction is bad or new construction is good. It's really, you will have all scenarios, and we need to be open to all scenarios.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
Maybe, Terry, just two comments. I think when it comes to policy incentives, to regulations, it is always essential for the policymaker to really look at the national context. There is not one policy which will solve all the problems we have in the sector. We need a mix of policies, and those policies need to be carefully designed on the specific target groups. We also need to keep in mind that there is not just one real estate or just one building sector. It consists of many different actors, a very complex and fragmented value chain. And all these decision makers in that value chain need to be, well, let me use the word exposed, need to be triggered for positive change, for positive decisions by specific and carefully designed policies. And tax incentives, whether it's VAT or any other tax incentives, can definitely play a very important role, but they're not the only solution.
Thank you very much. We have time for another couple of questions, I think. I'm going to come back to one from Roland Hunziker. And he's asking, do we know the $5.8 trillion investment does not include energy efficiency, or how do we know that? And how is incremental energy efficiency of investment measured? With integrated design strategies, there is not necessarily additional cost for efficient buildings, and material efficiency strategies can bring further cost reductions. Ian, do you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on the first, being that the overall value of the construction sector is the investment value of what that captures, about 5.8, for which that's what we're showing in the report, is that a segment of that is going towards energy efficiency as the incremental investment. In other words, as I said before, one could go out, my boiler breaks today, and buy the standard of the day. But if I chose to buy a more efficient version of that, that's what that number captures, is that difference between the standard of the day and the more efficient one. And it also, as I said before, it captures that, yes, a building overall will be built, and it's a part of that 5.8. But when I design and build according to a LEED certified standard, which is a more efficient or exceeds in a stretch code context, at a higher performance level, it's that additional investment that we're capturing in the 152. I have to say, Terry, if you could repeat the question that related to the other parts of the question, would be helpful.
Yes.
If you can find it.
With investment design strategies, there is not necessarily additional cost for efficient buildings, and material efficiency strategies can bring further cost reductions.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. So as a part of the numbers that the IEA look at in terms of how they produce this estimate, the material differences, or say where you're able to achieve a same as conventional. So the numbers don't only look at what the cost difference might be, they also look at where those are allocated directly towards high performance buildings as well. So they're aiming at capturing both, say, the number of buildings being built and the asset towards that, and looking whether there's a difference. But you're right, it's one of those things where if we're able to build low carbon efficient buildings at the same or lower cost than conventional, that's what the desire is. That's what we need to be doing. That 5.8 needs to be zero carbon investment ultimately.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure who this should be directed to, but Teresa Cody asks, building codes are very efficient change agents, but now very much target only EU. to achieve net zero? Cedric mentioned business case and radical collaboration. Ian mentioned nature-based design. How can the focus of building codes be changed to shift to the business case of nature-based design?
Yeah, so this is, maybe I'll just comment briefly on the building code side. Building codes in general have to be contextually specific. And this is where, when you look, no two building codes will be the same, but they'll have the same hallmarks. They'll have the same broad general framework around how they're implemented or how they're being adopted and enforced. And really, this is about making sure that there's clarity around what the standard is, what the intent of the design code is trying to achieve. And in some cases, it could be very flexible. It could be saying, you know, here is the minimum metric that we want to see achieved. At the same time, it may be that it has to be very prescriptive. And I think it depends on the market. And then when you're able to say, go the length, one of the key things that we've always said about building codes is that they need to be progressive. So they need to set out a very clear mandate going forward, whether that is in 5-year horizons, and allowing for those who are currently building to a standard that they'd like to exceed as a stretch, they're able to do so and know that their buildings will be both compliant for the future, but also being able to make use of that unique selling point. And so, you know, whether or not it's making use of different design approaches, nature-based solutions, or different materials, codes should be flexible to adopt those, but be clear in doing so.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think finally we'll request for a comment on the following from Young Chen at IRENA. What is your view on building integrated renewable energy options, or even positive energy buildings and building blocks, especially when it comes to green building codes?
I'm happy to say something on that unless somebody else would like to jump in first.
Please.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where net zero ready, as you said in the idea, is quite important, so that the buildings have to be, though, as efficient and provide a sufficient amount of energy services as they can be before moving towards renewable energy. And I don't mean that in terms of before moving, but it just means that if you were to build a conventional building and approach to then apply renewable energy, the resource demand for that might be too great that the building could support, or that the surrounding you know, availability of renewable energy could offer on the building itself. And so the idea being that you need to be as efficient as you can be in the design construction, so that the operations can better match with what the renewable resources are available. And renewable resources for different scale of buildings are very important. And that's where, when you begin to get into larger development, larger density, you have to go beyond, say, the building itself and look towards either adjacency in the site. And this is where opportunity for district energy really can play a role, both in terms of heating and cooling and electricity. There's a lot of integration that can happen at that urban scale. And so this will offer resilience as well when you look across, and particularly from yourselves at the International Renewable Energy Agency, is to be able to say, you know, how do you scale those across into the wider power market as well, be able to provide resilience for decentralized energy across that. So buildings play a really key role in being able to support those actions.
Martina, would you like, or Oliver, yes, go ahead, please.
Just to add one or two sentences to that topic. We are tracking also the renewable energy share in the index. And for me, and I think for GABC, it is part of the solution package for the future of buildings. But I see an enormous growth potential there, because if we look at the developments of renewable energy deployment in the building sector, we've more or less seen very slow growth. A bit of a boost in the last year, but before that, the growth was more or less stagnant. So I think it is an area which we need to push as well, together with energy efficiency. We just need to have all the solutions in the building sector to really fully decarbonize it as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Martina, would you like the last word on this?
Thanks, Terry. Well, I think I want to highlight one of the points that we made in our report, and that was triggered by the fact that we had seen a steady energy demand, but this increase in CO2 emissions. And that triggered us to say very forcefully that we need a triple strategy. And that triple strategy is what Ian already alluded to. Well, we have to be as energy efficient as possible, but we also have to look at the decarbonization of energy, of the electricity supply, and there obviously the renewables will have to play a critical role. And so it's the sector integration. And the third point is, as we already said as well, I mean, this reduction of the embodied carbon, so looking at the material side. And only if we look at that as a complete system, we will actually be able to unpack where we need to be. And I do see a couple of things coming in as well in terms of how do you influence it's the urban design, is it and I think that's important as well. I just want to, we say on the one side it's the sector integration, and the other one is, and Ian said that as well, we need to make sure that we don't look at the building on its own, but that we look at it in its ecosystem as the city, the neighborhood. And there's tons of possibilities as well to help reduce demand, particularly if you look at urban heat island effect and the cooling that is so much on the rise. In doing things, looking at urban form as well. So building in its context.
Thank you very much, Martina. And unfortunately, we have to release our panelists, but we would be certainly very pleased to arrange any individual interviews for any reporter who'd like to continue the conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, there is a recording of the session available. And in closing, I'd just like to thank all those who have joined us today and to congratulate everyone involved in this initiative. I'd like to thank especially our distinguished panelists, Martina Otto, Ian Hamilton, Oliver Rapp, Sergio Mendoza, and Cedric Demise. So thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I don't know if we still have Finn from Reuters on the call. Let me just see. Looks like she's dropped. Okay.